another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryan, and in today's episode, we're continuing through our series in VMware. More specifically, we're looking at the VMware Certified Professional version 6, and we're looking at installing vSphere. Joining me in the studios today is none other than Mr. Don Pizzette. Don, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Wes. Ready to dive right back into getting vSphere set up in our environments. And in this episode, we're going to be tackling host profiles. And I know what you might be thinking is, wait a minute, Don, didn't we talk about host profiles just an episode or two ago? And the short answer is yes, we did. But we went into it really briefly, right? So we got a quick chance to see what host profiles were and to apply them really briefly. What I want to do in this episode is spend a little more time on them because they're actually very powerful things thanks to their compliance and remediation functionality. So I want to demonstrate that and show it. I didn't have time in the other episode, so this time, now I've got the whole 30 minutes for me so I can jump in and do it right. So let's recap what we already know about host profiles, or what we don't know if this is your first episode that you're tuning into. A host profile is basically a collection of settings for an ESXi host. When you install ESXi, it's got a bunch of default settings, right? If you just pop in the CD and click next a bunch of times, it's going to install it, and you're going to have a host name of localhost. You're going to have a default data store called data store. You're going to have SSH disabled. You're going to have NTP not configured. You're going to have all these different things that are the defaults as they're set by the folks at VMware that made the install disk. And that might be fine for you. But if you're about to roll out hundreds or even thousands or maybe even tens of ESXi hosts, wouldn't it be nice if we could come up with a consistent set of options and roll that out easily to the virtual machines? All right. Well, there's actually two ways to do it. One way is to use a technology called auto deploy that we're going to see in another episode. With auto deploy, you can actually make a custom ISO image. You can make an ISO of ESXi. We'll see how many acronyms I can throw into this thing, so that when we do the install, it's already got everything set the way we want. It's baked into that disk. But that kind of takes a little bit of effort, and we have to build it up. But an easier method, one that works for new installs as well as existing installs, is a host profile. That installation image that you make with auto deploy, that works when you deploy the host. What do you do once it's already deployed, right? Let's say that I decide I want to enable SSH on all of my VMware ESXi boxes. So I set that up and I build an ISO image that has it enabled by default and I distribute it. Then one day Wes comes along and he logs into a machine. He's like, why is SSH enabled? And he turns it off. Well, that's it. Auto deploy takes effect when you deploy the host. I'd have to redeploy the host, which you certainly could do, but that would mean reinstalling on that host and bring it back up. It's not necessarily what we want to do. So with a host profile, that's our other option. With a host profile, I create a collection of settings, and one of those settings might be SSH enabled. And now I can apply that host profile to brand new machines that just came up, or hosts that have been on for years, that have just been sitting there and running, and I have no idea what state they're at. I can apply the host profile, and now, if I want SSH enabled and it's disabled, it'll turn it on. And then if somebody comes along, like if Wes comes along and says, why is SSH enabled? I'm going to turn that off, and he turns it off. Well, in vCenter, I'll be able to run through all my host profiles and check for what's called compliance. And with compliance, it looks at all the hosts, and it makes sure that they don't deviate from the host profile we've attached to them. If they do deviate, we'll see it. We'll get a warning message. It'll say, wait a minute, this is not right. And now we can remediate it. And by remediate it, I don't mean I've got to go to that machine and apply the setting. I mean, I click a little button that says remediate, and it tells the machine to correct itself. Now the machine corrects itself, and it's configured back the way we want it. So host profiles give us three big advantages, right? Advantage number one is that we can consistently deploy ESXi hosts. That every time we roll these hosts out there, we know they're set up the same way because we reuse this host profile. It's not like I had 20 settings and maybe I forgot one or two, or I did a typo here or there. It's going to be set the right way. So that's number one, consistency of deployment. Number two, monitoring. We can monitor our hosts to see when they deviate from that setting, right? So we have compliance. So we get that way to see when something changes versus maybe not knowing it. Wes might turn off SSH on an ESXi host, and I might not notice it for months until the next time I actually need to use it. I'm like, why isn't this working? And of course, that'll be the critical moment when I really need it, and it's not going to work, right? So we certainly don't want that. And then three, it gives us the ability to quickly remediate. So if it has been changed, I'm just a button away from putting it back and getting it put back in place and getting it running again. So really convenient set of systems.
Now, Don, you've been mentioning that host profiles contain settings. When it comes to settings or configurations, what kind of settings can we expect to see inside of the host profile that you can configure?
So there's actually quite a bit. Now, really, I don't want to be smug, I guess, but anything you can configure in ESXi, you can put in a host profile, right? So it's pretty much everything. But realistically, that's not normally going to happen, right? Because on an ESXi box, there's a lot of unique information. For example, a host name. I don't want all of my ESXi boxes to have the exact same host name, do I? So if they all had the same host name, how would I tell one box apart from another? So if I put that in the host profile, I would need to have a separate host profile for every single ESXi host. Now, you can do that, right? There's no reason you can't. You can do that. The only challenge there becomes if you want to update it, right? So maybe I decide, hey, I'm going to start using a different update server. And I've got that defined in my host profile. So I've got 100 hosts and 100 host profiles. If I want to push out a new update URL, I've got to go and modify every one of those host profiles to reflect it, and that takes a lot of work, right? And we do have some command line utilities from VMware, like the Power CLI. You can go and download the Power CLI from VMware as part of the SDK, and you can modify host profiles in bulk. That makes it a little bit less painful. But with the GUI tools, it's a nightmare. You'd have to go through and edit every one. So if we can have a single shared host profile across our ESXi hosts, that becomes really convenient, really easy, right? But it doesn't give us the flexibility. So you got to find a balance. So normally what you'll do is you'll say, all right, I've got a cluster of ESXi boxes. They're going to have one configuration. And I have another cluster over here. They have their own configuration. So you have multiple configurations, multiple host profiles, but you don't have a one-to-one ratio between host and profiles. So then we can go inside of the host profile and we can start to adjust settings, right? Usually things that are not going to be unique. We don't want to configure an IP address because every machine needs their own IP address. We don't want to configure a host name, right? But things that we can configure, things like the data source. I mentioned SSH, right? So all the services, whether the services are enabled or disabled, the firewall inside of ESXi, we can turn that on and off. We can open ports and close ports inside of the firewall, so that's easy enough to do. I mentioned the update URL. Pretty much anything inside of the networking and security and configuration settings inside of ESXi, you can adjust and configure and make them part of that host profile. And that's going to give us that consistent, stable deployment. Just be on the lookout for those unique settings because they are there. You will see them, and you might want to remove them. Just get them out of there. All right. So it's kind of up to you. Now, once we create a host profile, you create it inside of vCenter. So we're going to go into vCenter. We're going to build a host profile, and you usually don't build it from scratch. You normally start with like a reference machine. You take one ESXi box. You get it configured exactly the way you want, and you use that as the reference. You create the host profile based on that first machine. Then you can edit the profile to your heart's content. You don't have to go back to that one machine again. You can edit the profile, you get it created the way you want, and then you can roll it out. It works really well. But what if you have more than one vCenter server? Well, if you've got more than one vCenter server, the profiles exist in vCenter, and they're not shared by default. So we may need to export them, and you can export them. We can dump them out to a text file. It's not true XML, but it's something kind of close. It's a big jumbled mess, really, but you can read it. It is human readable. You can generate these little text files, and the text files contain all the settings that are part of that host profile. So we can export it from one vCenter and import it to another. So if you have a production vCenter deployment and a disaster recovery vCenter deployment, it's really easy to move these things back and forth between them. Again, it's all about convenience and consistency. All right, and we'll see exporting a little bit later. So those are some of the big things that we've got with host profiles, and I know I covered them briefly. We kind of got them out there. The way I used it in the other episode, what I was doing it there for was rapid deployment, right? If I knew I was going to be deploying 100 ESXi boxes, right, and I wanted to get them all configured quickly, I would just deploy them with a default install, set them with a root password that I knew, and then that way I could go into vCenter, I could import them all into vCenter, and then apply a host profile just to get them quickly configured, right? So that's how I used it in the context in the other episode. But in this episode, I wanted to focus a little more on remediation and compliance, right? Making sure that these settings stay, and so that's the other way that we use the host profiles. All right, well, enough talking about them. Let's see these things in action, all right? When you log into vCenter, so I'm logged into vCenter right now, right here on your home screen, you'll see your inventories, monitoring, administration, and what I'm looking for is this guy right here, host profiles. So you've actually got the host profiles icon right there on the main page. VMware knows you're going to use these things. And when I jump into the host profiles, you might get an interface crash like I just did, so we'll let that reload. If you don't get an interface crash, then what you'll get is your list of host profiles. And when you get your list of host profiles, it's going to be empty. And that's because VMware doesn't ship, or vSphere and vCenter doesn't ship with any host profiles by default. We've got to create them, right? So there we go. So now I'm in my host profiles, and that's the joy of web-based administration tools right there. So I can see that I've got 0 host profiles by default, and there's nothing in here. All right, and there's only 2 buttons for me, and the first button is just to add, right, extract a profile from a host, and the other one is to import a host profile. All right, I've got to get a host profile from somewhere, and the 2 places I can do it. One, I can extract it from a reference machine. So I've got an ESXi box somewhere that I've configured exactly the way that I want it, and I'm going to extract the settings from them. Or I can import. And if I import, if I click on that, it's going to ask me to browse to find a file, right? And the file that's created, it's a VPF file, a VMware profile format, VPF. And I would just browse and pick it and import it right in. And it's going to import it right here into this vCenter server. If I had more than one vCenter server, I could drop it down and pick the other ones and import it into them too, right? So I could do only one at a time, but I could sit here and do it right here from this screen over and over again. All right, now, unfortunately, I don't have one to import, so I'm going to have to extract it from a host. Notice it won't let me just make a blank profile. I can't just make a blank one. I have to at least start from something, an imported file or an existing host. Now, I've got an existing host. Let me go back to my home page here, and I'm going to take my ESX host 01, right? So I've got 2 hosts, host 01 and host 02. I'm going to take host 01, and I'm going to go into Manage and Settings, and let's go down to, what do I want to mess with here? Security. Let's take a look at the security profile on this system. Okay, I'm looking at the security profile, and I can see the various ports and things that are open. And what I want to do is I want to find good old SSH. So I'm going to come down here to Services, and here's SSH. Okay, so when I look at SSH, I can see that it is stopped. It's not turned on. It's not running on this host. Okay, well, I want to change that. So I'm going to go ahead and edit this thing. And I'm going to take SSH, and I'm going to start it. Okay, so now SSH is running on the host. And under the service details, it's set to start and stop manually. So what's going to happen if I reboot this host? It's going to stop it again, right? So I'm going to change that to make it start and stop with the host. So every time the host boots up, SSH is going to run. Every time the host shuts down, it'll turn it off, but it'll turn it back on again when it boots up. So SSH should always be running as long as I choose that host. It's running right now, and it started. All right, I'm going to say OK to that. And then I'm going to go up to the firewall settings. And up here in my firewall settings, I'm going to find SSH. So here's my SSH server. It's port 22, TCP 22. And if I look over here, it's allowed for everyone. Everyone can attempt to SSH, and that might be a little too big for me, right? So I'm going to add my network that my network admins work on. So I'm going to come in here and find the SSH server. I'm going to edit that setting, and I'm not going to allow connections from any IP. I'm going to limit it to my management network. Here in the lab, it's 192.168.0.0/24. In real life, that's probably not what you're using, right? And so you could add individual IPs here if you wanted, or whatever to your heart's content. I just want to get some security settings on this system. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. All right, so now, as soon as this refreshes, there we go, I can see that SSH is open, but it's limited to that network. Okay, so I'm going to use this as my reference to build my host profile. Now, when I go and take a look at host 02, this is my other host, and I go to Manage, Settings, and Security Profile, I can look, and SSH is still open to everyone. Okay, and not only is it open to everyone, if I keep scrolling down here, I should be able to find SSH, and it stopped. Okay, that's the default. If I had just installed ESXi, the port for SSH is open to everybody, but the service for SSH is stopped, right? So host 02 is at the default. Host 01 has now been customized. All right, so I'm going to go back to my home page and go back to host profiles to see if it crashes for me this time. Nope, there we go. So now I'm going to extract the host profile from host 01. So I'm just going to go here and hit that little green plus, And when I go to extract it, I've got to pick a host, and I've got a little warning on host 01. It might not be done with one of its tasks, but I'm going to ignore that. And you can do more than one host if you want. See, I'm on the filter tab. If I'd switched over to these selected objects here, you could like check off the different ones that you wanted. But we'll start with that one. We'll hit next, and now I need to give it a host profile. So what I'm going to call this is my, I'll just call it my ESXi baseline, right? So this is going to be a generic host profile that I'm going to use on any ESXi box in my entire company. But if I have a box that needs special configurations or whatever, I might have a separate host profile for them. But this one's just going to be my baseline. So if somebody's deploying an ESXi host and we don't necessarily have a specific purpose for it yet, go with the baseline. But then if you want something specialized, we'll create more. So I'll stick with the baseline. And then that's it, right? We just give it a name. And that's because it's going to extract all the settings from that host. And if I watch down here in my recent tasks, I'll see it run. It's not the fastest thing in the planet, because what it's got to do is connect, and it's going to pull a lot of settings out of there. Your network settings, your security settings. Let me read off the list because we certainly have the time. You've got your regular configuration settings and your advanced configuration settings. You know, there's like advanced section when you go into the Manage tab. It's going to pull these CIM indication subscriptions, which is part of the network management functions. We've got general system settings. I think I already said that one. Networking configuration, security services. That's what I want, right? That's where I did my SSH and stuff. And then the storage configuration is pulling that too. Now, storage configuration, is that something I'm going to want to roll out to all of my hosts? Maybe not, right? So some of these things that it's going to grab might go a little too far. So it's not necessarily suitable to take the host profile that's being made right now and just run right out and deploy it. I am going to need to edit it a little bit, and I can certainly do that. All right, it actually finished. So now that's done, I'm going to take my ESXi baseline, and notice that I got a lot more buttons. First off, you know, I don't just have the plus and the scroll anymore. Now I got a bunch of buttons. I can see compliant hosts, not compliant hosts, and unknown state hosts. All right, so what's this all about? Compliant hosts. Shouldn't ESX host 01 be compliant? Like, I just made this profile from host 01. It should be compliant, shouldn't it? Well, I made the profile from host 01. I haven't applied the profile to host 01. I haven't applied the profile to anybody. So as it stands right now, it's just a text file. It's just sitting there. It's not doing anything. Now, I'll probably want to attach it to host 01 so that I can make sure that I track and monitor it. I know host 01's already set up right, but that's right now. It might not be set up right tomorrow or a week from now. I'll need to track that. So when you attach this host profile to a host, it's going to show up as one of these three states, hopefully compliant. Compliant means all the settings on the host match the settings in the host profile. Not compliant. That means that either some or all of the settings are wrong on the host. They don't match what's in the profile. And then unknown state, typically that means that the host is offline, that we don't have network connectivity to the host, so we can't verify whether it's good or not, right? But it can also mean that it's new, that we just attached the profile and it hasn't had a chance to check all the settings. That's another reason, right? So those are the different reasons why you might end up in one of these states versus another. But as it stands, I'm not going to see much. Now, I could attach this to a host, and as I look at my new buttons up here, you've got duplicate a host profile, right? So if I wanted to create a customization off of it, I could. We've got copy settings from host. So if I want to refresh it by gathering settings from an existing host, I can, as opposed to re-extracting a whole new one. We've got our check for compliance, which we're going to see in a minute, as well as our remediate, right? Wait, here's remediate. Remediate to get things put back the way they are. But this is the one that I'm after right here, the little server. It says attach, detach a host profile to hosts and clusters. I have to attach the profile to a host before it actually works. Now, if I attached this to host 01 right now, I'd be okay, because the unique data inside of it is going to match what's on host 01, and so it's going to be fine. But if I were to attach this to host 02, I'm going to have some problems, because the unique data from host 01 is now going to try to be applied to host 02, and I'm going to get some weird stuff. So I need to edit this a little bit, and I'm just going to right-click on that profile and go to Edit Settings. And when we go into the settings, the first screen's not too spectacular, it's just a name. The second screen, though, is where the real action is. And I'm going to see all the divisions. These are the things that I read out just a few moments ago that we could store in here. And I said how security and services, that's the one that I cared about, right? Those are the settings that I was pushing. But you'll see where we've got our general system settings. And if you look, it's console, core dump, date and time configuration, and so on. So if I look at like date and time over here, we can configure NTP. Maybe I want every server to use a NTP server, right? So I can configure one and I can put in, I want them all to use pool.ntp.org, right? That's what I want them to use. And for a time zone, I might want a specific time zone like US Eastern or whatever, so you could specify it in here. I'll just leave that blank for now though, but I'm gonna set that time server. So that's a date and time configuration that I wanna push along. Now, there was a lot of other things in here that I might not want. So when I look at like console configuration, core dump, these are things that I might not want to include. And so I can just come down the line and uncheck those. I'm just turning them off. And so that's what you basically have to do is identify things that might not be consistent. vFlash. I might not have vFlash in all of my servers. So I don't want to push that setting out. So I'm basically emptying out the general settings here, except for date and time. Okay. And by doing that, I'm creating a subset of that one setting, but there's still stuff in there that is enabled. I'm not using SIM, so I'm just going to turn it off. Advanced configuration, I'm going to turn these off. Now, when I do this, it's not saying like blank out these settings. It's just saying if they already have a setting, leave it at the default. Or if the end user wants to customize their machine, fine, they can customize these, right? We're not going to enforce these settings. So I'm just removing those out. When we get to networking configuration, here you'll see vSwitches, physical NICs, and so on. I'm just going to turn all these off. I'm not actually going to use any of these. Most of this should be empty anyway. There we go. And notice the icon on network configuration. See how it didn't turn into a square? It stayed a black box with a slash. That means I missed some settings. So I'm just going to turn it off this way. I should have done that anyway. That's faster. Storage, I'm just going to turn that one off too. And then under security and services, here's where I customize the firewall configuration and I customize the security settings and the service configuration, right? So you can go through and tweak these and measure them, whatever it is that you want to do. Actually, I didn't set these, so I'm going to turn some of these off too. Let me just turn everything off. And then I'm going to leave service configuration and firewall configuration on. But if you drill down into that, you can see where I can limit it just to SSH if I wanted, right? I don't have to do them all. I could just do individual services or individual firewall ports, and that means that the rest of the firewall configuration will be able to be left alone. Here I'm kind of locking it down. All right, so now that I've customized that, what does my profile contain? Well, a time server and some services, right? And that's about it, right? That's all that's in my host profile now. So I kind of alleviate the risk of pushing out unique settings. So you'll customize this to meet whatever your needs are. This is going to create my baseline that I can now push out to the hosts and make sure that they're correct. So if I finish that up, now it's ready, and I just need to attach it to a host, which I can do by clicking on the profile and using the attach button, which is actually this guy right here. Nope, not that one. Which one is it? Here, this one. The server with the little green arrow on it. I can attach it, or you can just right-click on it here, which is what I normally do and go to attach because I can never remember what the icon looks like. So I'm going to attach that. Now, when I go to attach it, I'm going to attach it to host 01. Now, host 01, I already know SSH is set up right because I did it myself before I imported. But the time server, that's new, right? I didn't configure the time server, so that's going to be a new setting. Host 02, I expect it to be wrong for SSH and wrong for the time server. So you go in here and add as many hosts as you want. You can add 1, you can add 1,000, right? You can punch them all in here. And when I finish, right, it's going to bring up this screen, customize hosts. If there were any unique values, I'd have prompts right here to punch in the unique settings, but I filtered those out, which is always the best way to handle that, in my opinion. And we'll finish it up. Okay, so now we're good to go. Sort of. Right? If I look at the screen, I still have all zeros here, right? And it might still be applying. Let me look at my recent tasks. Nope, it shows as completed. See how it has update host customizations, right? So they should be rolling out, but this screen hasn't updated. So I'm gonna hit my little refresh button. And now I see that I've got no compliant hosts, no not compliant hosts, and 2 unknown, right? Remember I mentioned if they're new, sometimes it can take a while for them to turn up. They show as unknown. It's not that I can't get to them, it's just that they're new. So I'm going to usher this along by hitting the check host profile compliance of associated entities button. If I wait, eventually it'll do it on its own. But we only have so much time left in the show and I'm in a hurry. So I'm going to hit the button. I am impatient. That is one of my faults. And so it's going to run and it's going to do a check. Okay. Now the check can take a minute because it's got to reach out to those hosts. And so I see it running here. And I've got that check compliance now shows as completed. And up here, whoops, I'm just going to refresh my screen. There we go. And now what I'm seeing is I have 2 not compliant hosts. All right. Host 1 is not compliant because I didn't set a time server on it ahead of time. There's a time server in the host profile that's not set on the host. Host 2 is not compliant because it's missing everything, right? Now, how do I know that, right? Because I might have 100 servers and I don't know the history of these servers. So how do I know what's not compliant and what is compliant? Well, when you right-click on these things, you'll see a few different settings in here that you can do. Oh, actually, I probably should have pointed this out. Here's where there's export host profile. So I can dump it out to a file and actually use that. That's the VPF file that I can import somewhere else, right? So, you certainly have that option. But what I want to do is I want to go over here and click my ESXi baseline. This is kind of an optional step. I want to go to my ESXi baseline and go to the monitor tab. Because the monitor tab is I can figure out exactly what is not compliant. Now, why do I care, right? Like, I could ignore this. I could just say, hey, somebody's not compliant, let me reapply the profile and bring them into compliance. That's remediating the server. I could do that right now without even looking. But some settings require a reboot. Some settings could potentially lock me out if they adjust the network adapters, right? Some settings could cause a service interruption to my end users. So I probably want to know what I'm going to remediate. In a lab, in a test environment, I don't care, whatever. I hit the comply button, or the remediate button, and we push the settings out and we're done. But in production, it's always a good idea to look at what's not compliant. And that way you can figure out what impact you're going to have when you remediate the system. All right? If it's starting or stopping SSH, if it's setting a time server, those are non-invasive, right? The server will stay up just fine, your clients will stay in just fine, everything's going to work, right? But if it's something like adjusting a data store, or adjusting a network configuration, that can create an outage. It might be a micro outage, a very short one, but it's still an outage, and so you've got to plan it. You might not want to bring it into compliance right now. You might want to do it after hours, right? So to find that out, we go here into our baseline, and so just on the left side, I clicked my actual baseline, my host profile. I went to the monitor tab, and right off I see my issues. My issues are empty, and that's because being non-compliant is not an issue, it's just not compliant. It's kind of its own thing. But an issue would be when there's a failure. We tried to apply a profile and something didn't work, right? So that's when we'd see an issue. But if I switch over to compliance, now I'm going to see my host, and I see they're not compliant. And if I click on them, I'll be able to see why. When I click host 01, it's not compliant because date and time configuration is missing one setting. And if I expand that, list of NTP servers doesn't match, right? So I know, oh, it's just NTP. And if I click on host 02, it's not compliant. And why? It's missing date and time configuration. Let me adjust this a little bit so we can actually see. It's missing date and time. It's missing service configuration. The service TSM-SSH doesn't meet the policy. All right, so the service isn't set right, and the firewall rule set SSH server doesn't match the specification. So I can figure out exactly why it's not compliant. I knew it wasn't compliant already because we saw that back on the main summary screen here. But now I know exactly why. And I know these are safe to go ahead and remediate. So I can take that host that's not compliant. So I can take host 02 or host 01, I can highlight them, and you've got the button up here to remediate them, which is this little hammer and wrench, right? So I'm going to take host 02, actually I'll do both, host 02 and host 01. I'm going to highlight them both, and I'll just hit the wrench to bring them into compliance. So it's going to perform that action, and it's going to bring up a quick little wizard. There's not much to do here. If I had unique settings, here's where I have to provide those unique settings, right? But since I took those out, for me, it's really just a matter of hitting next, right? So I can hit next, and it's going to remediate them. It's reaching out to the servers. It's telling them the settings they're supposed to have, and they're going to put the settings in. And then we'll refresh our check, and they should both be compliant. So this is really cool because once a week or however often, I can come in here and run a compliance check. And I can scan 1,000 hosts. It takes just a few minutes. We scan the 1,000 hosts, and now I can find anybody who's not compliant. And with a click of a button, we can remediate them. So I can ensure that my ESXi host configuration is consistent across my entire environment. All right. So here it goes running, and notice what it's showing me. Here's my review. It's showing me that right now, I am able to talk to the host. That's what this green check mark is, and they're not compliant, right? We've got the red X. So it's identified that. It knows they're not compliant. I can even get the summary of what's not right, and so there's my summary. And when I hit finish, this is what it's going to do. It's going to configure a time server. It's going to update the firewall. It's going to set the startup policy, and it's going to get it put in place. Okay? So now, in the background, it's doing that. Here's the auto configuration. It's reaching out to those hosts and it's doing it. It doesn't actually do it until you hit finish. I could have hit cancel right there and just use that to see the summary. All right. Now it says that it's done, but if I look at my host, they still show as not compliant. Whoops, I closed that too soon. And that's because it's got to recheck compliance. It's two separate steps. It remediates, then it checks compliance. So it's running through and doing that right now. And as soon as that's done, there we go. Nice big green check marks. That's what I like to see. Compliant, compliant, right? Now if I go to my host summary screen, I can look, and I've got 2 compliant hosts, right? More importantly, I can verify this with my own eyeballs, right? I can jump into my home page, because sometimes I don't trust reports. I can go into my host and clusters. I can find ESX host 02. And under ESX host 02, I can go to Manage, Settings, go down to the Security Profile, and I can find SSH, and I've got a problem. Here's SSH server, and if I look across here, it's still set to all. What the heck? Well, I think this is going to be old vCenter not refreshing my screen. So let me just hit refresh, and I'm going to take a look, and sure enough, SSH is still set to all. So that apparently didn't update right. So we're going to have to find out what happened there. And as I continue to look down, I should see the SSH service. Well, it is running. SSH is running. So it looks like I've got a little problem. It said I'm compliant though, which is odd. So I'm going to have to go and find out what happened there. But it did start SSH, and that's why I've got my warning sign. You're not supposed to leave SSH running, and so that's why I've got that warning sign popping up there, which is why host 01 had it too, I imagine. Let's see, where is time server? Time server is buried right here. So if I look at my time server, I can see that, oh, I probably should have started the NTP client. I didn't think about that, but it did get pool.ntp.org, so it got that setting. That came through right. So I must have messed up my firewall rule. We'll have to verify that one. And when I look at host 01, it probably broke the firewall rule here. So we'll come and take a look at it and see what its SSH firewall rule is set to. I can see that SSH is indeed running on host 01, so that's good. And if I look at the SSH firewall rule, which is in here somewhere, ooh, now we've got some real inconsistencies there because it's showing that it's open just to that network. So what happened to host 02? Well, either I accidentally deleted that firewall rule from the profile so it's not being checked, or it's not actually in compliance, which this is why we always want to verify things. What I imagine is I accidentally removed the firewall rule, so I'll bet that's what it is. And so if I jump back to my home page, we can find out. I can just jump right back into the host profiles, and in my opinion, this is one of the nice things, is that let's say one day I get a call from the admins and they say, hey Don, we're changing out all of our time servers, we're moving to this new time server. Well, in the past, if I had 1,000 ESX boxes, I'd have to go to all of them to set the time server. But with a host profile, I can just come and edit it here and then remediate my servers. So I make the change in one place, and now I configure my entire environment. That's where these things really come in handy. So if I did botch the firewall rule, which I fully suspect I did, I can just come and add it back in here, and then it'll roll out and it'll be just fine. So I'm going to edit that baseline, and we'll just check and see what's going on. I know I'm out of time, but we can at least see where I made the mistake. So I can go and edit that host profile, and I'm going to go into my security services, into my firewall configuration, and my rule set configuration. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the SSH server right here, and I'm going to take a look at it. And here is defined, specify the configuration of a fixed rule set, SSH server, it is enabled, and then it's not allowing all, and it's got the network. Actually, my rule is correct. So in this case, one of two things has happened. Either one, my screen just hasn't refreshed, or two, there's some kind of issue going on with applying the profile to ESX host 02. Now, if I had an issue, that's where I'd be able to choose the baseline, click on the Issues tab, and it would show up here. Okay, but I don't have any issues. So I think this is just an instance of vCenter not refreshing the screen properly. I could go and I guess I could use the shell on ESX host 02, but you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to recheck compliance and just make sure when I drill into here, yeah, see, it just doesn't show it. It is very strange that it would do that. But we can go back to our host profiles, and we can always recheck compliance on this one and see what happens. What I may find is that if I go and check that profile compliance, that it shows up this time as not being compliant, right? Maybe it tried to apply the settings, it thought it took, and then for some reason it got undone again, right? It could be that host is actually being managed some other way, right? That something else got connected and set that in there. So I'm just going to double check that. And all right, compliance is done checking. I'm going to refresh this screen. It is still showing me as compliant, so that means the host inventory is messed up. So that can happen. vCenter does a good job of harvesting data, but every now and then it can get off on something. We saw where it got the NTP pool server. It did get the service start for SSH, so it started the service. It just didn't configure that firewall rule right. So I imagine that is just my screen. So let's just check one more time and see if it's already fixed for us. Otherwise, I'm not gonna get obsessive over it. So I'm gonna go into my settings, my security profile, and I'm gonna refresh that screen. And yeah, boy, that just does not. Let's see if it shows up under my edit screen, because edit's supposed to always show you the latest and greatest. And it sure isn't. That is strange. It is not bringing that setting along. So, all right, looks like I had an issue there, but we did see the other settings come along. This does reinforce the fact that you always want to double check your settings, run it on a test bed, make sure they work out, and if you've got an issue, you can go and track that down. Yeah, in my case, it just didn't want to push that setting out. So.
Yeah, I can see, Don, where just a wrong host profile setting, you can lock yourself completely out of a box, misconfiguring the firewall there. Now, it does look like we're coming to the end of another episode, but before we sign out, do you have any additional words?
I think we've kind of seen it. The host profiles are incredibly useful. So they're definitely something you'll want to use. Even if your environment is already completely set up, you can create a host profile off of each machine and just use it to track compliance so you can recognize when something changes. Maybe you've got a junior admin that enables SSH to use it for troubleshooting and then forgets to turn it off. Now you can spot it and you get it put back the way that you want it, right? You can easily get that set. Just always remember to double check for settings that require a reboot, because that can cause issues here. And actually, that might even be what I'm bumping into. The firewall service might need to restart. But just be aware of that and make sure that you only do the compliance, the remediation, if you can afford that downtime for settings that applies to.
Well, Don, as always, we appreciate having you here in the studios, and we appreciate you, the viewer, watching. Signing out for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.